We are going to start letting everybody trickle in. We will get started in roughly 1 minute. All right, it looks like we have people slowly trickling in here. So first off, thank you and welcome to our monthly webinar, Gray Associates Demand for Higher Education Programs. As always, a couple of housekeeping items to start with. At the very bottom of your screen, please put any questions you have into the Q&A section. That will allow other people to upvote their questions. We will try to get to them probably as we go along. We will definitely interview our two presenters today to get their feedback. If we can't, we will try to get them at the end, or if not, we will definitely follow up with you afterwards. If you have any comments and stuff like that, we always are looking for feedback. Two ways to give it, please put it into the chat. And secondly, as always, we have a poll at the end of this webinar because we always want to see how we can provide you with the best data information available. Without further ado, I will hand it off to our fearless leader, Robert Atkins, who will introduce our special guest today.
Thank you very much, Ned. And I'm Bob Atkins. I'm the founder here at Gray. And today I'm joined by Peter Holbrook. Peter, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Pete Holbrook, Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Tiffin University. It's my pleasure to be with you today.
And Pete and I will be going back and forth as we go through the charts. Of course, handling any questions you have. I hope we'll have a chance to do those as we go. So who's Gray? Well, Gray is the founder, the developer of what we believe is the first complete program evaluation system. As part of that, we assembled data about markets for academic programs, as well as internal operations. And we do that in a series of software applications. And they include data on markets, for example, student demand, employment, competition. They include data on your internal margins, program economics, revenue cost and margin by program, course, and section. We also keep data on academic performance. That would include things like DFW rates, faculty credit hours delivered, and so forth. And finally, which we collect from the faculty at the institution, the interaction of a program and the mission of the institution. But data is not all you need to do program evaluation. You also need a sound process involving the right people. So we facilitate processes that allow the organization to include the management team, the faculty, in an interactive, very transparent process with the right data in order to evaluate programs. We believe that's critical because there is no algorithm to evaluate programs yet. Someday, maybe not even in the too distant future, we'll be able to get close. But for now, it still requires judgment, and that requires people. And it's critical also that the decisions that are made are understood and supported by the organization itself. So that people and process is as important as the data that informs it. Speaking of data, let's have a look and see what's going on out there in terms of student enrollment and student demand in general. First, a word on the data sources for information about student demand. Traditionally, we've all been using iPads, and that's a great source. That's the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data Service coming out of the Department of Education. All of you file a wide range of numbers there, including completions and enrollment. The problem is that the only data that's by program is completions. The most current data is from 2021, so we're already a couple years out of date. But people decided what major to take 3 to 6 years before that. So we're really looking at data from 2015 potentially. And it's obviously that makes it pretty old when you're trying to understand what students want now. The next step is enrollment data, and that's very current. That we've got up to this spring in our data systems now from the National Student Clearinghouse. So that tells us what people want now. But what you really need to know is what people are going to want and be looking for next semester and next year. And for that, I look at Google because that's where students are searching. We're still considering what their academic choices are for the upcoming year and beyond. And as a Rorschach test for all of you, I would welcome your comments in the chat on what the heck this thing is that this guy is holding out in front of him. So if you have any thoughts on that, we've had a number of entries from the gray side. Please let me know. But think of that as somebody peering into the futures through an object that is unclear. Now, what has been going on in enrollment? It's actually been going up at the graduate level. I think many of you are aware of this. This is one of the critical growth segments in higher education. In 2021-22, fall enrollment actually increased 1.7% year over year. Spring was up a robust 2.3%. There was a decline in the summer, but it's the smallest of the 3 semesters, of course. That's a little bit scary when you see it go down 4.5%. Over this time period from 2018-19 to 2020-21, we've seen an increase of about 300,000 students from 7.1 million to 7.4 million, with most of that growth coming in the fall semester. So at the graduate level, we're still looking at a pretty robust market, and it's managed to stay pretty robust through COVID. Now, when we look at new enrollment, so that's not total, but just the new students who entered, the fastest growing program, interestingly, is mechatronics. And this is for programs at least 1,000 enrollees in 21-22. And fundamentally, this is the kind of study you do in order to go in and work in a factory and help with robotics and automation. The next two are pretty interesting, and we'll talk more about artificial intelligence in general in a few charts. But data science has been hot. It used to be a small program. It's not small anymore, and it's still growing like Topsy at 49%. AI, very closely related subject, up 39%. Let me make a distinction there between those two that I think is correct. If anybody out there knows better, please let me know, Pete, if you have any perceptions on this. When I look at data science, I think a lot of that is about the application of advanced analytical tools to solve problems. When I think about AI, I think it's about the development of tools that you may use to solve problems, as opposed to the application of those tools. So you're talking about a program that's fundamentally much more complex, much more mathematical, and in the realm of software development, as opposed to the use of software to solve problems. Then we get education, multiple disabilities. We have another education program, special ed, with 22% growth. Architectural building science tech, business analytics, very closely related to data science, sustainability studies, information technology, project management, and construction engineering. So a lot of STEM in the master's degree level. And always keep in mind that several of these programs are actually predominantly enrolled in by foreign students. And they like the STEM programs because it gives them a longer visa when the program is over, a better chance to get a job. When we look at bachelors, the story, unfortunately, is quite different. We've seen a decline here, quite a substantial one, from 19 million to about 18 million students enrolled. It's been a pretty linear decline, actually, roughly the same each year in numbers, and quite worrisome. We look at fall, it's down 2.1%. Summer was down 6%, and we did get a bump in the spring, but still overall, we're down quite a bit year over year and even more over the 3-year period. But there are bright spots. And when we look at the fastest growing programs in terms of new enrollment at the bachelor's level, cybersecurity is number 1 with 13% growth. And much like data science and somewhat closely related, this used to be a small program. It is not a small program anymore. And like data science, it's still growing, though not at quite the same pace at 13% growth. Then we get a couple of healthcare programs, health services, allied health, and public health. And then a series of other programs, sort of a random cast of characters here: finance general, cinematography, human services, and psychology, all growing 4 to 6%. And a couple more STEMs: neuroscience, aviation neuroscience, tech, and computer science. Now, keep in mind, anything where you see that tech afterwards, that's for technician. Typically, that's really going to be more of a 2-year program than a 4-year program. Then we get at aviation, it may be complex enough to warrant a 4-year program.
And Bob, one of the things that I use this type of an analysis for when we look at the growth in the markets is, how does this start to continue to shape existing programs that I have at the university and help me to measure how well we're doing? So for example, we have at both the undergraduate and the graduate cybersecurity. in information assurance, but we're also approaching more the defense angle. And what's interesting when you start to look at this and you start to see our applicant growth and our enrollment growth, cybersecurity, neuroscience, psychology, anything within the management area, this data really pairs up well as we're doing a couple of our big major, doing a meta major within digital media and film, video production, and cinematology. Graph is part of the things that we were looking at too.
Now, how are you doing relative to these trends? Do you keep track of your performance versus the industry?
Yes, what we do is every year we look at our program, what are our enrollments look, and then we use actually some of your systems and some of your tools to be able to see how that program should be performing, and are we performing what the market says we should be doing, or are we underperforming? And if we're underperforming, then we start to look at a variety of different things, from whether it's a programmatic aspect of that's preventing our performance, or is it something that we need to spend more marketing dollars or change the message? So it's usually a guide to us to say, how are we doing? And if we are doing what we should, we say that's a sustaining program, and we keep doing the same what we're doing. But if it's underperforming and it should be performing better, we spend a lot of discussion talking about, well, why is that? And then digging deeper into the information and what's happening on our campus to make a better analysis of what we need to do.
You use an interesting word there, Peter, which is sustaining. I think many of our clients think sustaining is a bad thing. And if you're growing at industries, let's say cybersecurity at 13%, there's nothing wrong with continuing to do what you're doing. So that sustain word's actually a positive. It means that you're doing the right things, you're investing an appropriate amount in that program, and you're hitting industry norms at least. So we often,
because we don't have the energy to address every program or the resources. So we kind of like to find a good half of our programs that are in that sustaining area, that we just keep doing what we're doing, pay attention to it, don't not pay attention to it, but we don't have to do anything extra and special. But it's usually those programs that are growing or should be growing that we start to really spend more of our time and our focus on.
Yep.
We got a quick question. Will you provide similar enrollment analysis by modalities?
Yes, we can do that. Yeah, we have enrollment by modality, by state, by county. So that's, and by program. So we can get in our systems, it goes very deep. The only thing we can't do in enrollment is tell you which school it is. But remember, you can track your market share relative to your peers without knowing exactly who those peers are. So you can keep track of whether you're keeping pace with the market. And you can get pretty close on figuring out how your peers are, but you kind of have to triangulate through completions data to do that.
And Bob, one more thing about this slide and that question about different formats and on online and that stuff, given the strong trend within cybersecurity and performance on our seated based programs, we are moving our undergraduate programs into the online format.
Interesting. A lot of competition there. I think University of Maryland University Campus, now called Global Campus, is a pretty fearsome competitor in that space. It's handy when you're across the street from the National Security Administration. So, which they literally are. You can see it in the highway. Anyhow, so now let's look forward at what Google says people want in the future. And I'm thrilled to have this data now because it's finally saying some positive things. So 2022 were the light blue bars, 2021 are the dark blue bars. And what we're hoping for when we present this is that the light blue bars are above the dark blue bars, and i.e. it's growing. And in fact, what we see in December is it was up 23%, and it's actually been up every month since last March. So we're starting to see indications that the long drought in higher ed may be coming to an end, and that there's reason to be optimistic that students are back looking at higher ed and thinking about going back to college. What are they thinking about taking? Well, the biggest program is registered nursing. And you all can have a guess, but I find what's interesting about this chart is, if you will, the dog that didn't bark, the things that are not on the chart that I would have expected to see. You can see registered nursing is number one. And if anybody wants to go in the chat and enter things that you think might be missing, let me know, or just go ahead and do it. I look at business administration management general. Yeah, we would expect those are two, usually number one and number two. Then you see computer science, and there's that data analytics coming back in the number 4 slot. Then we have law, cybersecurity. Again, you'll start to see that, I think, pretty consistently in the top 10 across all our metrics. Psychology, criminal justice, physical therapy, and human resources management general. So somehow or other, I classified human resources management as STEM. That might be a bit of a stretch. It probably belongs in other. But when I looked at this, what struck me is that when I look at these lists normally, I tend to think of seeing 2 or 3 or 4 healthcare programs up here amongst the biggest. And we're starting to see other things push those down. Now, it's not to say they're not high demand for healthcare, there is, but computer science, data analytics, cybersecurity, in the last couple of years are new entrants to these lists, and they're now coming up towards the top in terms of total enrollment. So worth keeping an eye on those. Again, that doesn't mean your healthcare programs are going to be shrinking, but the top 10 are changing. Now we think of fastest growing programs, and look who we got for our top 2. Not only are they some of the biggest programs, but cybersecurity and data analytics are also 2 of our fastest growing programs. So those are ones where if you're not keeping a very close eye on it, well worth it. Business analytics is 3rd, and it's really, I think, just a different name for data analytics. So you've got tremendous growth in that whole data analysis sector. Surge tech, registered nursing, secondary school education. In the next group, we've got a couple of arts here, fine arts, and there's cinematography again. So we're starting to see this pretty persistently in our data. I'm not sure quite what's going on in cinematography that's driving that growth, but there's quite a bit of interest in a decent sized program in the arts. I think we'll come to this when we talk about influencers a bit later on, but I think that is the influencer economy, if you will, and people wanting to be able to do their own video production in order to have their own shows and webinars and so forth. So I suppose I ought to be studying that. Haven't yet. Hopefully somebody on our team knows how to make videos.
So Robert, one of the things, Bob, if you go back to that, the whole video production and film, it comes also back to digital media and the whole digital media communications and the whole aspect that does come into video and different aspects of media. And so that may be one of the reasons why it's moving back forward and up. And business analytics can also be looked at in business intelligence. And so bringing in some of the artificial intelligence of that, as we've been looking to add some programs within the technology and business area, we've been looking at the intersection of business analytics, business intelligence, and data analytics.
Mm-hmm. And obviously it's the heart of our business. So we're actually hoping to pick off some of those people that have recently left Google and other places that I think are going to sprinkle some of this talent around the rest of the economy. I know that many of the banks, for example, are looking for that talent now, hoping that they can pick it up while the big tech companies are shedding some people. But keep an eye on cinematography. This is now months that we've seen this in the top 10. And I think it's tied to this whole influencer economy, as you mentioned. Non-degree courses, interesting stuff here. Many of you have talked to us over time and said, what do you know about things that aren't academic programs? They're not that full 4-year experience or even a 2-year master's. And there's a belief in it and a lot of substance behind it that that's a very hot space. Now, I will forewarn you, in my experience, it's a very difficult space financially. You're going to have to recruit a student. You're going to have to pay the kind of money you need to attract a student, and then you're going to only get them for 6 weeks. So keep in mind that you really have to think through the economics of less than degree programs, as well as their relative popularity. But if you can get to a scaled program like Coursera, you can make that work. The other way to make it work, by the way, is to recruit employers rather than individuals, and have an employer bring a whole cadre of people, a cohort, if you will, to your campus to study a particular topic. But recruiting people one at a time into these programs, I think, into these courses would be pretty problematic financially. So what are they? Well, personal growth is interestingly 3 of the top 10. Science of well-being, this is the leader, has been for a long time in terms of total enrollment. We've got learning to learn, powerful mental tools in number 2. And in the 10th most popular program on Coursera, successful negotiation, essential strategies and skills. So while this is a very technical platform generally, we still see a lot of things on here that are not technical. In particular, this personal growth category is hot and probably one you can take advantage of on campus as well. Certainly, there are plenty of us and plenty of college students who need a little bit more insight into how to stay mentally healthy. Programming for everybody, Python, not surprisingly, in the top 3. Data everywhere, that's our data science coming back, and we're seeing that here. Technical support fundamentals rounds out our 3 tech programs. What I find intriguing here too, as you all have heard if you've been here on my prior meetings, is that languages are alive and well on Coursera. Even though the interest in languages has been dwindling on almost every campus I've been to. You see Chinese in our top 10 here, English for career development, and I would suggest that that's probably foreign students taking English, though God knows we have plenty of people in the US who should be taking English for career development as well. I have hired several of them. It's just there's a lot of people who arrive in the workforce not really being able to write an English sentence. Then we see in the other category, financial markets and COVID-19 contact tracing. So fastest growing courses, Chinese is number 1. So if we think languages are passé, not quite. And keep in mind, though, this might be a very different student than you're seeing on campus. That could be an adult learner. I think some of these folks are actually, in retirement, and they finally want to learn a language that they've been meaning to do all their lives. Data is back, data everywhere. Project management in that tech space, I think predominantly. User experience or UX design, tech support fundamentals, and project planning, all really tech stack kinds of programs. But personal growth is still there in terms of unit growth at almost 500,000 new enrolled students. And questions to make data-driven decisions is here as well. And of course, English crops up again in our top 10. Do keep in mind that you shouldn't mistake an enrollment on Coursera as being approximately equivalent to an enrollment in college. It really is not. I don't know the correct ratios, but if you said only 1 in 100 of these students will complete a course, I think you'd be in the ballpark. And that's obviously very different than what you would have to have in order to have a successful program at your institution. But I think the metric, for these courses, some of which are even free, is a bit different. So it's not that the numbers aren't meaningful. They're a good indicator of what's popular. They're not a good indicator of what students will finish. Now, I mentioned influencer economy, and this reminds me a little bit of esports, where it's very popular. It's increasing in popularity, and it's really big. More people attend the esports championship in certain games than attend the Super Bowl. And what is that? Well, that's somebody on their couch watching somebody else on a couch play a game. In many ways, this influencer economy can seem frivolous, but it's not. It's actually quite a large sector in our economy. And why people want to watch somebody else's lunch, I'm not sure. But it works. People relate to these personalities, and it's a very effective advertising medium as a result. And it's very popular amongst our students. So while it may not make a lot of sense to me, it makes a lot of sense to the kinds of kids who are going to college these days. And there is actually money to be made doing this if you're good at it. And one thing that people, I don't think, recognize is it's actually a lot of work. If you're going to be a successful influencer, you've got to be on practically 24 hours a day, catching trends and commenting and retweeting and so forth. So this is not an easy way to make a living, but it is really almost a brand new way to make a living. And hot topic on Coursera. Go ahead.
And Bob, if you have like a digital media communications type of program, this is an important element that I think you need to start building into curriculum, which is content creation, but then also how do you use that to influence and to drive business. And so I think it's going to become a more important, if you will, skill, background, ability to have, not only in the marketing field, but also in the digital media field.
It reminds me, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but a program with the wrong name isn't going to get found. And I think if I were naming media these days, I would name it influence, using digital media or whatever you want after that. But the keyword to me is, why do we communicate? We communicate to influence other people. And if you start with that, I think the odds of catching these folks change. a lot of the other words to me sound a little dated, like digital communications. It's like, well, what other kind of communication is there? If you think about it these days, you know, it's almost harkening back, it's dating ourselves, right? And I'm
And it
very
may be,
dated, so.
and it may be dating ourselves when we still say, but we're looking at history, moving it into digital storytelling and digital history rather than just history or public history. But we're going to talk about how does it become storytelling and recording of current history as we
Yeah, creating history.
Yes.
I've often thought if I went back and taught in high school, one of the things I do is ask the students to record the history of a day and
Right.
all the different aspects that the school that take place on a given day, from the school's financials to the results of, you know, 10 games that may be played on a given Wednesday. And the concept that you could have that one day viewed through so many different lenses. And a lot of the data is very transient, so it would, you know, just normally disappear. So anyway, I think there is what you were saying, and we bring a couple of themes here together of the idea of cinematography, history, and making that more accessible to our current student. Employment, let's take a look at what's going on out there. Now, all of you read the papers. I think you might have seen today, GDP is actually up 2.9%. If you look back historically, you could make a living as an economist predicting 2% economic growth. I think a number of economists have done that. That's kind of the average, and things bounce around, but they ultimately revert to 2. So 2.9 might not sound like a lot, but it's actually very fast economic growth. And I think we see that in job postings. Despite all the actions of the Fed, job postings are up. And this has been pretty persistent in being strong. You know, it looks like it's dropping year over year when you look at those dark blue bars versus the light blue. But keep in mind that last year, we're actually coming out of COVID. So there are a whole lot of jobs being filled that had been laid, you know, where people have been laid off in the prior year. So we saw a very artificial spike in job volumes, a big spike, but again, created a little bit by a trough before it. Now I think we're seeing numbers that are more stable and higher than they were in 2019 pre-COVID. So very encouraging in terms of what's going on out there in the job market. Keep in mind, however, that that's not necessarily good for higher ed. You know, the more jobs there are, the more likely a student is to go to work rather than go to grad school. Or if you're in a community college sector, I think you get particularly hard by people who might go into a trade rather than coming back to college. What's hot? Well, you can see the very top of this list is registered nursing. That's not unusual, 53,000 folks, jobs being posted for registered nurses. When I looked yesterday, over the last 12 months, there were about as many job postings for registered nurses as there are registered nurses. So we have a very severe shortage of nurses in the United States, and I don't see any end to that because our ability to produce nurses is capped by the nursing regulatory bodies. And at some point, something's got to give because it's going to have an impact on patient care if it hasn't already. And in many cases, I think it has. We just don't have enough people in the hospital to take care of folks. Now, the rest of this list is similar to the one we had before, where, you know, I was surprised not to see 3 other healthcare jobs in the top 10. But what I see in this is business bouncing back. Human resources, marketing, customer service reps, management analysts, construction managers, financial managers, accountants and auditors, sales managers. We've really got a wide variety of fundamental business roles that are in high demand right now, more than I've ever seen before. One of the things I look at here is I only see 1 software job on here. Normally, I'd see 2 or 3 of the top 10 would be software of one flavor or another. So I think what's happened is we got caught short a little bit in the basic management jobs in industry, and people are struggling to fill those. By occupation, there is a myth out there that I keep pounding away at, which is people go into the field for which they're supposedly directly prepared. That is not true. Okay, so for all of you out there who have liberal arts degrees, there is hope after graduation. Not every history major is going to become a historian, or we would have a lot more historians than we do. And similarly, when you look at marketing, most of the people in marketing do not have a marketing background. You can see we got a couple at the top: marketing, market research, and communications. That accounts for approximately 1/3 of all the people in the field. Then we have just a general business degree. The next two slots, advertising and public relations, pretty tight. So now we're up to about 36%. Then psychology, journalism, literature, mass media, politics and government, all sorts of other fields. And if we went down into the 1%, this list would go on for 50 or 100 other academic programs. So do keep in mind that especially your liberal arts programs may not be tightly correlated with a particular field, but there are lots and lots of jobs for your graduates from the liberal arts. I look at history and there are 500 occupations that history majors go into. And we end up earning at the 80th percentile in the US. So all this stuff about, the idea that I'm going to go learn this and I'm going to go directly into something that's related is essentially not true unless you're a nurse. And 82% of nurses do go into nursing. So, but everybody else kind of goes to a lot of different places. What's trending up and down? Registered nursing is trending up from an already high level. And then you can see, again, all of our business related fields here are trending up. Trending down a little bit, but off very high levels. Where do people make money? Remember what I was saying about healthcare? This list kind of changes to that. Out of our top 10, 7 of the top 10 highest wage occupations are in healthcare. Dentists, family medicine physicians, surgeons, nurse practitioners, physicians assistants, veterinarians, I guess a bit of a stretch for healthcare, but my dog would appreciate that I'm counting him in. And medical and health services managers, all well over $100,000 each. One of the things I found intriguing here, when you look at physician assistants, nurse practitioners, very close, not quite the same pay, but they're not that far off surgeons. So there's some programs here that have relatively limited educational requirements. You don't have to go to college to med school for 6 years. That can move you up substantially in terms of earnings potential, and of course, in terms of role in the healthcare system. A nurse practitioner in particular can diagnose and prescribe drugs. So there's a lot of potential there for the individual. Even as specialists, when I went in to see recently a specialist for physical therapy for a shoulder, I expected a doctor, but the person I met was a nurse practitioner, and she's absolutely terrific. So there are an increasing number of roles for these high skilled but not med school healthcare professionals. College athletics is a sideline. We keep track of this a little bit. We're developing our database. And you look across participation rates in sports. Lowest is interestingly Division I. These are all the sports we all know. This is the guys we watch on TV, but actually a very small percentage of the population at their colleges. Where you see higher participation rates are Division II and III, and small colleges for athletes will be 2% of the population or so. Now, if you want to get an idea how much that varies from college to college, I've spoken with 2 colleges recently where 40% of their students are involved in athletics. And one of their primary recruiting tools is sports. Go ahead.
So Bob, at Tiffin University, we're Division II, 70% of our students are engaged in student athletics at our university. So well over 1,000 of our undergraduate students are engaged on a daily basis, regular basis within athletics. So it is one of our largest pipelines, if you will, and recruitment lines to the university. It is also then presents many other challenges, but it's also one of our key ways of attracting students to a rural institution like Tiffin University in Seneca County in Ohio.
How many sports teams do you have? Do you know?
We have about 22.
22. Are you thinking about adding any?
Yes.
What are the criteria you use for picking a new sports program?
We look at a number of different things. The number of the size of the squad that we have, that we want to put in together. What is the startup costs? What is the sunk costs, and how do we do? So we're just adding, if I can do this right, field hockey and some other different sports at the university that will be able to generate additional students at the university. So we tend to look at larger teams.
Larger teams, long roster.
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking long roster, short expenses.
Right.
So field hockey is pretty much a field that you probably already have, right?
Yes.
Although at many colleges, those fields are pretty busy. So, that's something that does have to be taken into account. But Yeah, I've heard that. I think it is one of a number of growth strategies. It's really quite viable. What's your experience with the students who come to college as an athlete? How do they do compared to everybody else?
They are as engaged as other students. They have the same type of student capacity or capability. I think what drives them is first and foremost that ability to participate in their sport. And so it's usually what we have to do is help them to understand there's life after being on the field or the court, and then how do they start to shift what they want to do if they're not getting the playing time. And so we do spend a lot of time looking at how do we retain the student athletes, and then how do we redirect them and keep them engaged at the university. And so it's a real strong enrollment driver, but it's also a driver that we have to look at of how do we retain and keep those students and help them to persist towards graduation.
Yeah. Well, I had two boys who were college athletes, and I think they studied sometimes, but as I understand it, in general, college athletes are actually better students than average, not worse. And certainly a number of their peers were pretty accomplished.
Pete, I don't know if you could talk to this. We are trying to develop the data on this, but there's a question about what about retention numbers for athletes?
So retention numbers, it depends upon the institution, and we're actually spending a lot of time and diving into this and then putting into place strong retention programs. So we do see that we tend to keep our student athletes just a little bit under other students at the university, but there's usually about, depending upon if they're scholarshiped or if they're just a general student athlete, anywhere from a 68 to a 70% retention. But you have to get through the first 2 years. And so we see our biggest attrition in our student athletes from fall to fall of the first year. And if we can keep them engaged and moving forward and into that sophomore year, we tend to have better luck at moving them through. So if you do this as a recruitment to process and a whole pipeline within that, you also have to have a corresponding pipeline to be able to, how do you engage them and retain them? And it's a very tricky student body to be able to do. And so we spend a lot of time trying to think through this and develop different strategies. And from an academic side of the house, we are looking at how do we advise these students differently, and what do we know about the students who happen to be in a walk-on athlete, and then how do we help them when they're enrolling in certain majors to make sure that we're having the conversations in the classroom and out of classroom of the Tiffin advantage and how they can stay engaged without athletics.
Mm-hmm. You know, the ability for athletes to perform at or above the norm it varies a lot by college.
Yes.
You have a very high participation. I've never heard 70 before, so that may make it more challenging. But most schools I've talked to, the athletes actually persist at a higher rate than the non-athletes. And I use persist. I know it's not the same thing, but sort of as the same thing as graduation rates. So keep that in mind. It may not be precisely the correct term. But they generally have a higher GPA and higher retention rates than non-athletes. I say generally. In some cases, they definitely do. So I don't think it's open and shut. It really depends on how it's managed by the institution. And as I say, if you're at 70%, you probably have bigger challenges than somebody might with a smaller percentage of athletic participation.
But our overall
real quick, how many undergrad students do you have at your institution? We had a question.
we are about 3,000 students at our university. So between seated and online, we're about 1,500 undergraduate students, maybe a little bit larger within that.
So sports is a big deal, and it's a big deal from a recruiting standpoint. And as Peter points out, how you manage those students once they get there so that both they and the institution have a successful experience, I think is really important. As the coaches used to say, you're one knee injury away from being a scholar. And everybody kind of has to keep that in mind and make sure that the scholar is being nurtured along with the athlete. And usually a problem in D2 and D3. You get up to D1 and it's very difficult to keep those two things well integrated.
And we celebrate that our student athletes are actually doing quite well in the classroom, that's all above a 3-point average GPA. And
Yeah.
so this spring, we had our best performance of our student athletes.
I think the other thing that's interesting is they do very well afterwards in many cases. So, turns out I have not an athletic bone in my body. But it turns out to be one of our criteria for hiring, because we find folks who have a sports background do better. It's been knocked down. They've gotten up at 6 a.m. to get to the hockey rink. All those experiences you have in a sport are really good training for things that are going to happen to you in life. What do people participate in? And here it's not total number of people involved in a squad. So when you're thinking of Beater's long roster, these are the teams with the longest rosters. So men's football comes at a price. Track, though, at 67, relatively inexpensive to run. Women's track right behind it at 58. Women's track indoor and men's track and field outdoor down at the bottom of the list, but still among the top 10. And then you see baseball, lacrosse, track and field, men's soccer, and ice hockey. Careful with hockey. That's an expensive one. I was just talking to a client who spent $70 million putting up a rink. So I wouldn't do that as a financial move. Let's put it that way. What is expensive to run? And I'm still unpacking these numbers to understand why these particular sports are expensive. As I just mentioned, it doesn't surprise me that ice hockey is expensive, whether it's for women or for men. You've got to rent ice time, you've got a ton of equipment, you've got a variety of coaches that you have to take care of there. But it does mystify me why men's archery costs $17,000 per participant. I didn't know arrows were that expensive, but there may be something else going on there. One thing that could be true is if it's a very small squad with a coach, that coach to player or athlete ratio may be driving the cost up. You see swimming towards the top of the list. Basketball, men's skiing, still in the top 10, but relatively lower. Now let's take a look at our program of the month. And what we've picked for this is artificial intelligence. And we're going to evaluate the market for that academic program. To do that, we're going to look at student demand, employment, competition, and degree fit. And I mentioned it's AI. Here you can see how AI ranks overall relative to 1,500 other academic programs. It's at the 92nd percentile. And that ranking is being driven by strong student demand to 94th percentile, relatively low score for competition that's offset to some extent by high employment potential. And in this case, the degree fit is neutral. Everything's scaled to 50 since we haven't picked out a particular degree level to focus on. But keep in mind, above the top of this list, there are a bunch of other programs that score 93rd percentile or higher, and hundreds of programs that score 90th percentile or lower. And we think that's important because if you're looking for a new program, this might well look like a good program, but you got to keep in mind there's some others up here that we're not looking at right now that might be even better. So distinguishing good from best is very important when you have limited money to spend on program development. We use colors. So green is good, red is bad. Dark green means it's a 98th percentile for a metric. So that's very, very good. Within this particular program, there's a lot of stuff grouped. So it's a bit of a messy zip code classification instructional program or program. It's got things from robotics, machine learning, computer science, and artificial intelligence. All sorts of programs like that all end up grouped into this computer science and artificial intelligence category.
Bob, do you find a lot of the STEM related types of programs and technology that you have to look at a variety of different SIPs to be able to make an analysis?
It's very idiosyncratic to the zip code. And so, yeah, that occurs in sciences, but it also occurs elsewhere. Some of that ends up being a problem of changes in the zip coding. We redid them in 2020. So you have to be very careful about year-over-year comparisons. As a silly example, vet tech got regrouped into agriculture. So there are a number of articles written at the beginning of this year about how agriculture was suddenly a growing program. It wasn't, but there were a lot of vet techs that suddenly got classified in there that made it look as if it were growing. So there are those kinds of changes. Anytime you see an emerging field, it may not be well represented by zip codes. It may not even be in them at all. Only in that last correction in 2020 did they add data science, for example. So yeah, it often helps to look at the 2-digit zip code, the discipline, if you will, and then scan down that to see if the program you're thinking of might have one or more other names that you're going to want to include in the analysis.
So in a case of an emerging program or an emerging area, is it really that you start to look at student demand then and Google searches and?
Yeah, you start to look at the things where you look for the words rather than a zip code.
Okay.
And you can do that on both sides of the equation. Student demand, you mentioned Google search volume. You know, you can put in keywords that you think are related to that topic and see how it's trending and what the volumes are. The flip side of that is you can do that in labor market databases when not searching by occupation or some of the traditional roles, but actually doing, again, keyword searches against those databases to see what's trending, particularly at the skills level. That may be important. So, for example, in our labor market database, you can actually search on a skill, you can look at trending skills, and that'll get you down below that relatively superficial level to see things that are trending in a more detailed way. Here, I found this interesting because we're actually getting 4 different reads on this program. Google search is actually only at the 88th percentile, international 98th percentile, new student enrollment, very good at the 96th, but pretty different from Google search. And then finally, we have completions, which are only at the 82nd. And then if you include online, the 78th percentile. So, you know, not bad, but not spectacular. And some of these numbers on international new student enrollment are pretty great. So there's a divergence, if you will. And I think that's a time series that we're watching. So completions, remember, that's a trailing indicator, up 19%. New student enrollment is what's happening right now, up 338%. Looking forward, Google search up 7%. So I would say we might be looking at a little bit of a peak starting to come down, possibly an interpretation of that information. You'd want to look at this over time to see if it remains fairly consistent or if that starts to change. And we'll see some more data here in just a moment about it. Now, that was an initial interpretation. Then you start to look at more current information. You can see here that 17% is pretty consistent with what was happening until December. And then we see a spike up 54% in the month of December in Google search volumes for AI. So something's coming back. The other thing I should mention here is that very strong international demand. This is likely to be a program because it's in STEM, because it's a hot technical topic, that's going to see a ton of demand from overseas.
Hey, Bob, real quick question. Do we think that the spike in December might coincide with the launch of ChatGPT, considering it's the most powerful AI tool ever built and they really advertise it that way?
Well, it's the most interesting tool ever built. You know, it's very possible that that's part of it. It's really a funny thing with these numbers. You know what they are, but you don't know why they are. So I think that's a reasonable hypothesis that people suddenly realize that AI is here. And that's something that's positioned as AI. I think a lot of the rest of the growth in what you might think of as AI is actually taking place in under other words like data science, business intelligence, and so forth. So all of which depend on AI tools, but aren't exactly AI. But certainly ChatGPT didn't do it any harm. Total enrollment up to 62% annually since 2018. So I don't see any particular reason to think this is going to end or slow down too soon. And again, a little bit of a concern that Google search volume was off, but that's offset by the most recent month where it looks like it's rebounding. So I would keep an eye on those monthly numbers, but at a minimum, it's still growing. It may not be growing at 62% a year, but certainly even the lowest number on that growth rate was 7%, which is pretty healthy for higher ed. We look at jobs, good job market. It's not a big field yet. In terms of size, it's 40th to 50th percentile. That's not surprising, I don't think, in a field that's as technically complex as this. Part of the constraint actually may be that you can't hire people to do the work. So it's not that the demand isn't there, it's that the supply isn't there. And those two often interact. But I don't see this being a huge field. This is more of a field where there'll be highly expert, a relatively small number of highly expert people. Also keep in mind, if AI is the title, it's probably for the development of AI tools, not for the use of AI tools. And the number of people who have the intellectual horsepower to do development is very limited. This is really hard stuff when you get into the math underneath it. You can see the growth rate here, up 1.4% 1 year, up 4.2% over 3 years. We do keep the BLS forecast. Not much good as a forecast. About 80% of those are off by 50% or more. but always interesting to kind of keep an eye on it, see what BLS thinks is going on. Just please don't base your decisions on the BLS forecast. Job postings, 4.1 per graduate, and mean wages are actually not as high as I would have expected at $83,000. I would have thought that a field like this would be commanding higher pay. And in December 2022, the highest volume related to this was data analyst in terms of job postings. And then you can see the rest are pretty much software jobs, building AI systems. Who's looking for these folks? Your accounting and consulting firms primarily at this point. So if you will, that's kind of the leading edge. The professional service firms pick them up, in effect, sell them back to large corporations as a service. And then as this large corporations can, they build out those resources themselves. So I expect this list will change over the next 5 years, but the biggest employers for now are your consulting and accounting firms. Excuse me, I'm going to pick out JP Morgan there too, because I think the banks are going to start picking folks up in this field to the extent they haven't already. Job postings, interestingly, fell a little bit. Not what I would have expected. Again, I think it's partly classification, and people are probably more looking for the data science folks, and people are going to, as I say, use AI to solve problems as opposed to build AI from scratch. Competition, 19 schools offer this program online. It's not a ton of schools, but it's still relatively high compared to other master's programs. What concerns me here are the median completions. This is a pretty small program at the end of the day. Only 2 completions on at the median, and only 16 at the average, which obviously is being brought up by one school who must be fairly large in the space. So if I were thinking about this isn't a big program. That would tend to make me want to head back over to data science and some of those other job program titles rather than focusing on this, unless I'm going to offer a PhD program in AI and be able to get to that level of depth and that quality of student. And what degree level? Well, in the completions, it's predominantly masters, not much going on at the bachelor's and certificate level. And then in terms of doctoral, it's only 8%, but 8% is a very high number in terms of the proportion of students who are in doctoral programs versus, say, master's programs. So that's actually a pretty rich representation of doctoral. In terms of who's doing this work out there, interesting. I think because you can't find enough master's and doctoral students, we got a lot of people with bachelor's degrees who are learning to do AI. Again, I think it's probably more about a labor market shortage than it is about what skills are required to do the work.
So Bob, would you take that into account if you're looking at trying to add something at the undergraduate level?
I think I would.
It's a master's, but
I think I would. I'd be torn personally, and this is just my judgment, between AI and all the data science, business analytics, and so forth. But that doesn't mean there might not be room for an AI program. I think I'd want to make sure that I understood its content well enough that I was confident that the kinds of students I'm attracting are able to do the work.
Yeah.
I think I look at myself and I say, I probably have the intellectual horsepower to use tools in this space. We use them here at work. We can get artificial intelligence kinds of models to run without having people who are specialized in AI, but they are business analysts, and they do have that training in business analytics and data science. Do we have many people who could build those algorithms? No. We do have a couple, but that's a very limited audience, I think. So that would be the balance I would put on it. If I'm an R1 institution, first of all, I probably have this program. If I'm not, I'd have to think hard about it and where it's appropriate and how large I should expect it to be. On the other hand, it may turn out that you've got, well, I don't know. When I look at programs, I always think, do I have the courses already? And can I repackage them? And yes, some of the math and so forth that you have may already be foundational for this kind of program, but I think you get out of normal college math pretty quickly. I'm out of my depth though, so I should be clear about that. One thing to keep in mind here: 59% of the students are international. So if you're thinking about this program, you're probably going to be drawing from overseas. It
I
also,
think that's the most telling on this demographic part of who would be enrolling in the program.
and it would attract students from overseas. So, and you know, the other thing I always think about when I look at these is, what am I doing to the demographics of my campus? And am I getting the kind of student I want? Am I bending the curve towards being diverse and inclusive? And you know, this only has, what is that, about 28% participation of women. Actually, interestingly enough, that might not be a bad thing because men are way underrepresented on campus. Typically in the United States, it's 60-40 female to male. So I don't want this to sound chauvinistic. It probably will to some years, but the underrepresented group between men and women is actually men. So programs that will attract men, you know, may be something that's important. But here we also see that Asians are attracted, but you know, we're getting very small representation from our Black and Latino community. So again, when you're thinking about what do I want my college to become, you have to take into account the demographics of the program and what your goals are for DEI as one aspect of program evaluation. Hopefully the Supreme Court won't make that illegal. And then we bring it all together on a single page for you, so that you don't have to hunt around through a variety of sources and pages and systems to find the answer. And again, the colors can be a pretty good guide. When you look at this, yes, there's student demand. You can see that bright green for international, okay labor markets, and a fair amount of competition in your call small programs. So when you get good at this, you can really use the colors, and it's almost at a glance to say, is this a program that I want to invest in? Certainly, it's pretty obvious when the answer is no. Obviously, it's trickier and you want to dive deeper. If it looks like it's a maybe to yes, then you got to go in and really take a very careful look at the numbers. So let's summarize. In December, Google searches for academic programs increased 23% year over year. That is not bad. And I hope that's going to be reflected in the enrollment that all of you see at your campuses. Cybersecurity was by far the fastest growing program in terms of search volume. So that is red hot. We look at the fastest growing master's degrees, mechatronics, interestingly, not one I've seen before. At the bachelor's level, cybersecurity again. Job postings is finally up in December, which is great. The creator influencer economy is emerging on Coursera with over 40,000 people that took its influencer marketing certificate recently. And demand for masters in artificial intelligence, I think high. I probably overstated that. It's moderate. And it is going up, but off a fairly small base, and that is predominantly international. Not clear what's happening in that employer market. Maybe people are moving out into using other nomenclature for similar jobs. I wanted to come back to one thing here, and cybersecurity. Many of you probably think of that as a technical program where I have to be really good at coding. There are actually two kinds of cybersecurity skills needed. One is, yeah, technical. I got to understand a bunch of systems. I've got to be able to potentially find somebody attempting to pierce my firewall. There is another dimension to it, though, that is really for people who have a good attention to detail and can write. An awful lot of the work here is writing up policies and procedures and keeping track and corralling and limiting the weak point in your security systems, which is your employees and your students. And the kind of delivering the training required so that those folks don't expose your systems, because that's really where most of the exposure ends up coming from. Not necessarily intentional, but nonetheless exposure. So there's a lot of work to be done in cybersecurity by people who aren't super technical, may not know how to do coding, but they do understand the technology at a conceptual level, and they can explain it well enough to write policies on disaster recovery as an example, and communicate and train your people.
It's one of those programs that if you have a solid base, you can then start to put in concentrations or specialities that students then could be able to hone into and still be in the space, but in something that's suited for their background and interests.
Yeah. So you start with some computer science, and if people realize in sophomore year they're not going to be a coder, there's still a path. So, well, Peter, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And I hope you'll be able to join us for other webinars in the future.
All right. Well, thank you. It was great to be with you today.
And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Very much appreciate your taking the time out of your day to be here. The charts will be available to you as well as the recording shortly on our website. So if you can't find them, just get in touch with Ned, actually, not me, please. And he'll find them for you. So thanks again for joining us and look forward to speaking with you again next month.
Just a quick update, everybody. The next will be the last Thursday of February. So we will be sending out invites very shortly. There it is, February 22nd. So it's a short month, but we will get our data ready.
Oh, and I forgot to plug my book. So it's there, it's on Amazon, and it's just wonderful.
Thank you, everybody.
Ned, why don't we stay on?
Yeah.